Welcome to the Joanne Avison podcast. In this episode, in this second series on sacred geometry, we're bringing to life the contributions to understanding the human body that sacred geometry makes through some fabulous figures in history, and we're going to make our way to the modern day. There is a skeleton in almost every anatomy classroom in the world. It hangs from a hook or it stands on a little wheeled stand, and it is, in its way, a beautiful thing. Every bone is there, every curve of the spine, every joint, every rib. It cannot stand up on its own. Look closely and you'll find the trick of it. A steel rod runs up through the middle where the spinal cord should be, or wires run from bone to bone, holding the shoulders to the ribs, the pelvis to the spine, the arms and shoulder blades together. The whole thing suspended like a marionette with its strings showing. Take away the rod, take away the wires, the skeleton collapses into a pile of bones on the floor. And that should trouble us more than it does. What has actually been removed when a skeleton is built for a classroom is not incidental. It's actually the entire context of its original formation, the continuous connecting tissue matrix that we've come to call fascia. The tendons, the ligaments, the whole living, tensioned architecture that the bones were never separate from in the first place. They grew within them. Remove all of that, and what you are left with is what classical biomechanics has been asking us to believe for hundreds of years. A stack of hard parts held up by a column, carried like a passenger on a pelvis, held up by legs, waiting for us to learn a lever system to explain how it all moves. It never could stand on its own. It was never going to. It doesn't ever exist that way. By now you know the shape of where we've been. Leonardo da Vinci, a few episodes ago, saw the spine as a curve and drew it first, or as near to first as anyone we can point to. He looked at the entire human body and saw moving architecture, the weave of the myofascial matrix laid bare in ink centuries before anyone had a word for what he was drawing. He learned the geometry it was based upon. Kenneth Snelson found it with his hands alone as a student one winter in 1948 without knowing what he had found. He activated the codex of how force transmission works in nature. That should be up there with Edison's light bulb in my world. Not that he invented nature, but just a way of modelling it. He revealed its brilliance. Now, Buckminster Fuller recognised it, named it, and gave it a home in a new view of classical architecture, creating domes that could span vast spaces using almost nothing in terms of materials. He didn't know his own body was already doing that brilliantly. And now we come to the maker who took that idea somewhere none of the others had taken it, not into a gallery or a rooftop, but into the shape of the human body itself, built by hand, tested by hand over and over for the better part of 30 years. His name was Tom Flemons. And to understand what Flemons was building, it helps to go back further than his workshop, back to the very beginning of a body, before it's a body at all. In the earliest weeks of an embryo, deep inside what will become a limb, there is a bud. And that bud begins to form a growing tube that self-organises within tubes, within tubes, within tubes. That innermost tube is not yet bone. It's potential bone, what an anatomist would call the anlage of the bone. And it grows roughly 8 times faster than the tissues surrounding it. That inner tube grows inside an outer tube, the one that will become the other tissues, the myofascial aspects with their tendons. the yet to become ligaments, the cartilage, all of what will become what we call a limb. The inner tube grows so much faster, it naturally tensions the outer sleeve around it. It pulls it into folds, and those folds settle at certain areas or points, and we call those resting points. Biomechanical people call them joints, which is short for pin joint, and there are actually no pin joints in a human body, so it's very difficult and misleading to study at the outset. That means, strictly speaking, they're not technically joints at all. Now, the embryologist and anatomist Jaap van der Waal has a better word for them. He calls them disjoints, places where the tensegral architecture or structure is allowed to partially uncouple, to permit motion, without ever actually breaking the continuity of the whole. In other words, the texture of the material at a folding point changes into something that softens slightly to allow movement and resting points and folds. It never turns into a lever or a hinge. Hinges and levers take us into the wrong branch of physics for describing humans being and moving. However popular it's become, just because we have 400 years of being spellbound by this language does not make it true. The bone that eventually forms inside that embryonic tubular structure is, at its centre, still a kind of fascia with all the collagen elements of any other fascia, but with a particular specialisation that stiffens it into a more crystallised form, and it is stiffened by hydroxyapatite. It's part of the process of forming, and it can be translated into other liquid crystal mediums. Something like how chocolate can be soft and viscous and harden into a bar of chocolate without changing its nature. It's also a liquid crystal. If you remove the mineral content out of a bone that effectively starches it, what is left behind is soft and pliable and almost like a thick tendon in structure. You can try it with a chicken bone in vinegar for a few days. You'll be able to tie a knot in it afterwards. Put the hydroxyapatite back and you have the hardest tissue in the soft matter architecture that we're made of. Our forefathers have been bending the human body to fit their inaccurate explanations of joints for 4 centuries of study. Not for the first time in history, and it simply makes it harder to break the spell, but it still makes no sense. And this is the ground that Flemons chose to build on, demonstrating why breaking that spell provides us a much more valuable way to consider the human body as it actually is. Now, he wasn't out to dismiss biomechanists. He focused on replicating a more honest model, one that actually holds itself up in space in any direction without a rod up its spine or wires secreted at every joint. One that makes sense of how humans move instead of reducing them to something that they don't and can't actually demonstrate. Tom Flemons did not come to this work through a laboratory or a university department. He came to it through his hands. And for close to 20 years, he worked almost entirely alone. No conferences, no colleagues who understood what he was doing. Just sticks and string in a workshop, trying to build a structure that could stand upright the way a human body stands upright, using nothing but tension compression principles. No glue, no rigid joints, nothing borrowed from architecture or biomechanics that hadn't been tested first against the living form and how we all actually hold ourselves upright and move around. Now, out of that came the toys many of you may already know. Small wooden and cord structures that collapse into your palm and spring back into shape the moment you let them go. And if you have ever owned one, it likely came from a company called Manhattan Toy. It's called a Skwish. That's not where they began. Flemons designed them himself and sold them under his own name for years before licensing a small manufacturer in 1987. Manhattan Toy bought the rights later in 1995. Look up the Skwish toy. He built further than toys, though. He built a standing human figure, a pelvis, a spine, each one tested the way an engineer tests a bridge by seeing whether it would actually hold itself up in space and restore its recoil ability. What Flemons kept circling back to in his own writing was a simple, stubborn question. If the body has no fixed fulcrums, how can it have levers at all, or even joints? And there's an older story behind that word, joint. Let's think about this. Aristotle, who lived in 384 to 322 BC, used the phrase resting points. He meant it precisely, and that history makes a crucial point. What is now called a joint to Aristotle was a place where a living body found an internal point of stillness in company with the ground itself, an external resting point that together allowed the whole creature to move. He incorporated the essential element of stillness in motion that we'll go deeper into in a later series. But first, let's see how that essential aspect of being human was lost in translation. Over 1,000 years after Aristotle, a mathematician named Giovanni Borelli wrote his own book and gave it the same title Aristotle had used, De Motu Animalium, on the movement of animals. It was published in 1680, a matter of months after Borelli had died. He never saw it printed, and in fairness, he couldn't have denied or determined what was published. Giovanni Borelli lived from 1608 to 1679, kept Aristotle's idea of a resting point and inaccurately renamed it a joint, which is short for pin joint, as if that constituted progress. Then he ran it through the geometry he trusted most, which was Euclid's geometry, straight lines, fixed points, primarily based on very simple machines. He turned every joint into a fulcrum and every limb into a lever, and he found, correctly, that most of the levers in a human body are working at a serious disadvantage, trading force for range of motion rather than gaining any mechanical advantage at all. He made that up on paper. The premise was wrong. The physics was wrong. So no wonder the results don't make sense of nonlinear biologic forms. We are nonlinear biologic forms. It is careful, patient, mathematically honest work. It is also geometry that describes a machine, not a living, breathing, self-organising form. It's not the geometry Leonardo da Vinci drew by hand a century and a half earlier. It is not the geometry Kenneth Snelson would discover with sticks and string nearly 300 years later, inspired by Buckminster Fuller, who was determined to describe architecture as a living advantage. Borelli built his book on the right question and the wrong application. Humans don't reduce to 2D right angles in flat planes. We are all born round. Big error, great big huge. In fact, he is the father of biomechanics, and there is nothing biomechanical about you. Organic, self-organising architectures don't have levers. A lever is bound by definition to one plane. It needs something solid, such as a pin, to hold it together and to push and pull against. Our joints are not fixed. They move, they float. They are wrapped on every side by tissue that is itself moving. Yet we lift, we climb, we stand on one foot on a rock face and do not fall. We climb climbing walls, hanging on by our fingers and toes. We do all the gymnastic feats we see at the Olympics. We do so many things, from cartwheels to yoga poses to ballet to catching a child running into our arms, that make no sense of lever-based mechanics whatsoever. That might be because there aren't any in nonlinear biologic forms. Flemons spent years building models to test this idea. 4 rigid levers linked in a closed chain worked perfectly well, even with one of their fixed pivots removed entirely. The whole structure, he found, could substitute for the missing part. He called it, at one point, the floating fulcrum, not a fixed point holding the system up, but the system itself acting as its own support everywhere at once. Think about that. It's not a small thing to have shown, with sticks, string, and 30 years of patience. For most of that time, Flemons worked without knowing anyone else was asking the same questions. He didn't know a clinical anatomist and exercise physiologist was asking something similar to explain human motion through human anatomy. And this colleague of mine has spent his own career arguing that there is no such thing as an isolated joint anywhere in a human body or a lever. There is only a continuous architecture pretending, for the anatomist's convenience, to be dividable into separate parts. You will meet him in a later episode. But back in 1999, working mostly alone, Flemons made contact with Stephen Levin. In 2001, almost by accident, he came across the work of Thomas Myers. In 2006, at a conference in Seattle, Flemons did something rather wonderful. He wrote to me about that experience, and I quote, "I remember introducing them and then standing back to watch the sparks fly. It was a quiet giggle between us, and I treasured his gentle manners and devoted determination to learning rather than speculating." In September of 2015, as co-chairs of the presentation committee, John Sharkey and I wrote to Tom Flemons on behalf of the Tensegrity Summit to tell him we wished to honour him with an award for his contribution to the field. His reply was warm, and it was honest in a way that stayed with me. He wrote about the isolation of those early years, about not being a scientist or a clinician, only a man with a hands-on understanding of tensegrity, worried at times about claiming more than he properly understood. He wrote gently that his health might not allow him to attend. "Sorry to be so ambivalent," were his actual words, before wishing me well with the very book that would go on to carry so much of his work forward. Tom so generously read my book, Yoga, Fascia, Anatomy and Movement. It isn't really a yoga book, but anyway, and remarked on how we both held the same vision. Given the cover images I had designed for that first edition and his own efforts to put his Tensegrity man model inside a net. There's pictures of it in my book with his permission. We spoke on the phone on one particular occasion, and what struck me most was his gentle insistence on demonstration. However, what stayed with me ever since wasn't about the models, remarkable as they were. He stressed something that he said to me directly, quietly, almost in passing. He paused and then almost pleaded. "Watch out for scientism as distinct from science," were his words. I asked him about that distinction, and he elaborated for me with such patience. He meant it kindly. He was helping me distinguish the hype from the actual demonstrable models. He was not warning me away from the science either. He was warning me away from listening to anything that turned it into a creed or a brand, or that made it sound like something closer to guru talk than honest, simple inquiry. He warned me gently away from ideas that built egos rather than ethos. He did not want his spine images used to prove anything. He was very clear about that. They were a sketch made before the age of AI or advanced computer modelling of a possibility, a way the architecture of a human spine might hold together if it followed the same rules his hands had already tested and found to work. That caution has stayed with me since. It still shapes how I want to present this work to you now. I am, as I write this or speak this, the age Tom Flemons was when he died. And since his death, a colleague of mine has built further on the ground he laid. A model using an actual orthopaedic spine, wired in the geometry Flemons would recognise, and I believe approve of, that holds itself together entirely on its own, even when held by its sacrum. It holds its integrity parallel to the ground. From coccyx to occiput, it can hold itself together with nothing more than tiny wires to represent the myofascial components. However, They're organised in such a way, with such a consciousness of their geometry, that they act more like Flemons' experiments. It is a stunning thing to see, and I cannot wait to create an episode with my colleague Corinne. Look out for it. It's also, I think, exactly the kind of demonstration model Tom Flemons would have enjoyed. He spent his whole working life quietly, patiently moving towards such models that asked bigger questions rather than providing sensational answers. I use his Skwish in every presentation I do with huge gratitude for how brilliantly it explains our human energy birthright, the natural spring in our step. Free, elastic recoil energy. Nothing that a lever would recognise. And if you ever find yourself holding a Skwish toy, notice what happens in your own hand when you let it go. It doesn't fall apart. It doesn't lock rigidly or behave like a puppet that can't restore a movement unless someone pulls a string. It simply returns. It bounces back the way you do, the way all of us do, 100 times a day, without ever once needing a lever to do it or explain it. That is the invitation. It always has been. Notice that. Tom Flemons spent 30 years building the proof by hand, one model at a time, mostly alone and mostly unseen. And what he was reaching for, without quite having the tools to confirm it, was already true at a scale even smaller than his workshop. Inside the cell itself, every cell. And that is where we're going next to meet the next protagonist in this series. I will see you in episode 6, where we will encounter Donald Ingber, the Harvard biologist, who took this same principle all the way down to the living cell and demonstrated over and over again under the most rigorous scientific scrutiny that tensegrity is not a metaphor for how the body works. It is the foundation of how living architecture of humans and creatures functions, communicates, and holds itself together in space and in time. I cannot wait to see you there. Keep those comments coming. I love them. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. And please click subscribe if you haven't already, and dive into the series before this one, which explains the Platonic volumes. And keep watching, because we've got some fabulous work coming up in the future for you to join in with. God bless.